Before we get into the core of the topic that I want us to discuss this morning, I want to return to a little bit of background since we stopped rather abruptly in the middle of Newman's Anglican experience at Oxford, and maybe jump forward to his experience as a Roman Catholic and his reason for coming to Dublin to found the university, which is the rationale. He's laying out the rationale in this collection of discourses for why a university in Dublin can and should be created. So let me set the stage for this a little bit. Newman leaves the Church of England in the midst of massive rejection of his vision of Anglo-Catholicism, a very Catholic vision of the Church of England, which had its precedents in the 17th century, also roundly rejected by the more Protestant elements of the Church of England in the 1630s that led to the Civil War. I've written a book on one aspect of that controversy around Sabbatarianism, the book that's called The English Sabbath. But one of the things that stood out in Newman's struggle to find a way forward into his Catholic experience was this polemic that he was famous for, very anti-Catholic polemic, asserting that the Anglican tradition had been true to ancient Christianity, had provided continuity in a way that Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, as he conceived it, had not. Protestantism, he said, was reflected in innovation and change. Roman Catholicism was struggled with many centuries of corruption of dogma and doctrine, and so in the early 1840s, when his vision of Anglo-Catholicism was rejected both by the bishops and in the popular press, Newman found himself really struggling with the paradigm that he had created, this way of thinking about principles of Christian past. And over the course of 1842, 1843, he began to talk about something that he termed development. Now, Newman's not the originator of this idea, although many Newman scholars in the past have sought to assert his uniqueness. This idea of development or organic growth of doctrine in the life of the church was something that he absorbed passively. Some think, I would argue, through his disciples much more actively from the Tübingen Catholic theologians of the 1820s and 1830s. A subject that I've written on and find really intriguing. But by 1843, his last university sermon is a kind of précis of what becomes a 500-page or so essay on the development of Christian doctrine that is really his apologetic for why he's becoming a Roman Catholic. Now, if you read the introduction to this edition of the Idea of University, you'll find that our editor indicates that this concept of development received a very chilly reception in Rome and was marginalized. I'm happy to say that one of your colleagues, Michael Shea, one of my former students, has completely and thoroughly debunked this idea, and has written a book that's the new standard for understanding Newman's reception, early reception in the Catholic Church. He did it very simply. He's gifted with languages, and when he decided to start studying this dimension of Newman's life and work, he took off to study Italian and started reading the Italian journals published in Rome after Newman's conversion in 1846, 1847, 1848. And what he discovered was far from Newman's idea of development being marginalized. It was enthusiastically received because it was solving a problem. There were theologians and right up to the Pope who were interested in defining the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, and they couldn't get around inconsistencies that they were finding in the evidence. And Newman's essay on development, his theory of development, provided a way forward that they hadn't really taken seriously before. And so what Michael was able to demonstrate was that far from being marginalized, it was received with critical enthusiasm by the best theologians in Rome. And while the language of development was guarded and was actually excluded from the dogmatic definition itself for strategic purposes, reasoning, the underlying issue concept was there. So that's Newman's earliest impact on Roman Catholicism. Within 2 or 3 years of becoming a Roman Catholic, he's having a surprisingly profound impact on the way of thinking, the shaping of general principles of thought around theology in the Catholic tradition at the center of the Church in Rome. Newman came back from his brief period of study in 1846, 1847 in Rome. He was never comfortable in Rome. He didn't like being there. He could speak Latin, but his Italian was never the best. And if you listen to Italians speak Latin and Englishmen speak Latin, it's a challenge. So the difference was profound. So he was not comfortable there, but he made good relationships with Italians like Giovanni Perrone, Giacomo Mazzio, another important theologian in Rome. He came back to found the first of the English oratories, and the oratorian tradition was something that Newman revived and really implemented and has become quite widespread in English-speaking regions of Catholic Church. He loved the idea of the oratorian tradition because it had a rough approximation to his experience of an Oxford College fellowship. It was a place where men with a common purpose, with diverse interests intellectually, could live together, engaging in some common labor, but also had a certain kind of independence of life. They weren't bound by a vow of poverty, for example, but they were bound by a commitment to fellowship and to care for one He made good progress in the establishment of an oratory in London, and then before moving on to Birmingham, where he spent most of his Catholic life in that industrial city. But in the early 1850s, the Irish bishops invited him to come and establish a university in Dublin. Well, there are certain things that we have to be mindful of when we think about this. What happened in the late 1840s? Anyone know their Irish history?
Yes.
The famine. That's right. It was a country in deep distress because of the blight that affected the potatoes in Ireland. Many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people died of starvation, and many more immigrated to other regions of the world. The Irish diaspora was accelerated by this. Paul Cullen, who had been the rector of the Irish College in Rome, had spent for more than 2 decades, was sent to back to Ireland, and he had a singular kind of purpose. The Irish Church up to that point, the mid-19th century, had been quite an independent one in terms of its episcopate. They subscribed to a view of the papacy that was not as monarchical as Rome wanted to promote, and an approach called Ultramontanism. And Paul Cullen was determined to transform the Irish Church into an Ultramontane church as opposed to a Gallican church. And education, he hoped, would be one of the vehicles for that purpose. Newman himself was a self-styled moderate Ultramontane. He had a high view of papacy, but also had a deep respect for the local church. The episcopacy was in a bit of a turmoil in Ireland at the time, and so he stepped into a very difficult situation, compounded by the fact that he was an Englishman seeking to serve an Irish Catholic church. And so the dissonance between his own ethnicity and nationality and the aspirations of the Irish people were a tension as well. So when you read about Newman, as we will discuss later this morning, talking about the importance of knowledge for its own sake, he's talking to a people who have been deprived of a university education for many generations. They've been excluded from the one university in the country, Trinity College, Dublin, because of their religious affiliation. And so how do you convince people who are emerging with a national identity, who see as their primary way forward through trades and commerce, valuing the importance of education and the kind of refinement that Newman has in mind for the university that he's created. So this is all necessary context for understanding what Newman's going to talk about in the 2 pieces that I've asked you to read, both this morning and for tomorrow morning. Another important thing to be mindful of is that the British government, in their campaign to try and pacify the population, had tried to introduce higher education, but they sought to do it in a non-sectarian way. In the 1830s and 1840s, they created 3 campuses, 3 colleges that were known as the Queen's Colleges, a tribute to Queen Victoria. But the compromise in those settings was to explicitly exclude the study of religion, faith tradition altogether, from the educational agenda for these institutions. And it's for those reasons that the bishops rejected this effort by the British government and really mandated that lay Roman Catholics not take advantage of the Queen's Colleges. And so the compromise that's being put forward here is for there to be an explicitly confessional Roman Catholic university in Dublin, sponsored by the church and the funding raised by the people of Ireland. So I wanted to make certain that I got that background there. You can probably tell I'm a historian at heart, so context is always important. Unlike philosophers that I know who think that it's only the text that matters. I'm looking at you, Greg. Let's sort of set ourselves up for a discussion about the topic of the discourse that we're looking at this morning by thinking a little bit, moving from the historical to the personal, and raise the question: why have we, in our own time, pursued an education? Why is that important? Why has that been important in our lives? I'll tell a little bit about my own personal journey, and then I want to open the floor for discussion about not. We talked about university experience yesterday. I want us to talk about personal motivation today. Okay. Just a little bit about my own background. I told you that I grew up in a mill town on the banks of the Yadkins River in western North Carolina. My father grew up in a different mill town, and his parents grew up on the farm. They migrated in the 1920s, early 30s to Kannapolis. I didn't know until after my grandmother's death, but my grandfather was completely illiterate. He couldn't read or write. My grandmother had an 8th grade education, and so it's quite remarkable to think that their 2 sons both earned doctorates and became professors of education in the North Carolina university system. My uncle Gerald up in Boone, my dad at a historically black university, Winston-Salem State University, after finishing his doctorate at Duke. So you can kind of imagine in our household, education had a very high priority. My father was also very enterprising and became a prosperous person by my teenage years. And so that even opened more doors. And my father offered the opportunity for all 4 of us, all 4 of the children, to go as far as we wanted with our education. He would support us. I was telling Matt about this morning. my father's one condition was that he would support us completely as long as we were single, and he would pay our tuition after that. I was that anomalous kid who decided that education was more important than marriage, and so I went right through my PhD program with generous support from my family. I have to say that I point to that as a huge privilege, and really kind of marked my sense of what an education could provide. And much of what Newman talks about in the idea of the university is something that resonates, even though I had not read this in my 20s, resonated with my sense of what I valued about education. I was a great lover of the arts from early on, music, artistic, the physical arts and things of that sort, and travel played into that. So for me, the study of history became my avenue into things like music, painting, the history of painters. I was not terribly interested in theology, quite frankly. As an undergraduate, I imagined I might pursue the study of a history of politics. But it was a profound religious experience in Little Episcopal Church that drew my attention to the history of Christianity and directed my interest there. I had a deep desire to understand what had divided Christians through the centuries, and my focus became the Reformation, and that's what I eventually studied at Cambridge with Eamon Duffy. But I don't think that I fully appreciated the extent to which I had been sort of guided and motivated by the quest for degrees until I entered the monastery. And I discovered there that deep desire for learning that had no connection with programmatic structured study. Reading the Just Fathers, reading ancient patristic sources and medieval authors, and that love of learning for its own sake was something that really came through in that period, and has consequently affected the way that I think about teaching and what motivates me as an instructor in the classroom. So that's a kind of a thumbnail sketch of what drew me toward an education, and while it differed from my father's, who saw education as a way into a career, my path was a different one from his, but one that he respected and embraced over time. How about yourselves? When you think back to your education, what drew you to pursue the courses of study that you undertook? One word or a phrase. You can tell I like doing this.
I'll start on that, sure. That was planning to start. I chose sociology because starting college in the 1960s, I was looking for the model that would inform my thought on the transformation of society.
Okay. So for you, it was about the transformation of society.
Yeah.
Yes,
Wonder.
pardon?
Wonder?
Wonder. You gotta explain.
Okay, so I mean, as a scientist, I actually have a vivid memory of being in 7th grade and learning chemistry for the first time, and it just kind of blew my mind because at that point, I think the smallest thing that I could imagine was a cell. So to think that there are things smaller than cells that make up cells just kind of blew my mind, and I needed to know more about that, and so I've been on that journey ever since 7th grade. So I was just, yeah, I was struck with wonder.
Excellent, excellent. That's beautiful. I love that. Yes.
Well, that's exciting to see the confidence. Like there's family lore I don't remember, but I came home from 1st grade and said, I like A's.
I love it. Yes. A's were never easy for me, so that wasn't something that drew me to
That was my 1st grade exam.
yeah. Excellent. Yes.
I just love English, I love literature, I love writing, and I just, I don't know when I decided to, well, I guess it was in college, I decided to pursue it as a, career, but, and I think I always loved the way it connected with transcendent, because there is that aspect of literature that always, like, for me at least.
You're creating.
But it's also, the literature itself, like, taps into theological things. I've always found that connection. That for me is what makes it never get old. Just one.
Excellent. What you described reminds me of, I have a young friend, well, he's not so young anymore, but Francis Spufford. He's written an autobiography entitled The Child That Books Built. He came from a very literate family. His mother was one of my mentors at Cambridge. His father was a medievalist, a numismatist. But Francis has gone on to become an award-winning author of nonfiction and fiction. Brilliant books, I have to say. But he describes in the opening passage of the Child That Books Built, the entire family being ill and bedridden when he was 4 or 5, and somehow he managed to pick off the shelf. House was always full of books. Lord of the Rings, and he was, he's the kind of brilliant child who picks up a book like that, and slowly over the course of hours, because he was on his own, dragons started appearing. He was able to sort of teach himself in a way that I can't even, it boggles my mind.
Really cool.
But he was a ravenous reader, and it shaped his imagination and his understanding and view of the world. He had a wonderful education in many ways, but his mind was not structured in a way that made him easily successful academically. He didn't want to go to Cambridge, for example, because both of his parents were there. He wanted to go to the University of York, but he bombed his A-levels, and there was a special place that enabled him to go to Cambridge. Cambridge was his fallback position. Others? Yes, great.
Melinda, go ahead.
Oh, I would just to connect with Nancy, love of literature from, when I was in grammar school.
Right.
It kind of never occurred to me to study anything else.
Right.
But when I came here, studying literature opened up my awareness of so many other fields, just learning about the different periods and history involved. And so it was really a wonderful opening experience.
Right. Excellent. Wonderful. Right?
Yeah, for me, I would say, maybe a little cliche, but kind of existential questions. I lost a sibling as a preteen and just had questions and felt like originally literature classes, the Iliad in particular actually, was more honest about human life and death and grief in particular. And I think in some ways it was a process of elimination to find a discipline that could kind of both handle these things and let them be asked in their most forceful forms. And I settled on philosophy instead of literature. But
Excellent. That's fascinating to me. But in a certain sense, you describe literature as being one of the gateways
Yeah.
to those philosophical inquiries.
Absolutely. Novelists ask better questions than philosophers most of the time. Novelists ask better questions than philosophers a lot of the time, I think.
As a theologian, I would say the same thing. Yeah, that was in many ways my approach as well. Yeah. Yes.
For me, helping others. So I chose for like my specialty Christian ethics. And so I thought, like life is messy. And all of, our existence is basically making choices and acting and interacting. And understanding how we do that can help better serve people in difficult life situations and for personal growth and help others too.
Excellent. Excellent. So that sense to reach out and to assist others in need. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
It's hard for me to put this in words. It's music. Music just brought everything together. Didn't matter how fractured things might have been, along whatever faults there are, within our human communities. But music makes all that disappear. And for me, that's when I felt most whole. Just in the presence of music. And I wasn't necessarily the best little girl all the time. So get into trouble, whatever. And, my mom was doing like this and thinking, well, okay, but music kind of would just dissipate all of that mix and make it all whole. So for me, the unification and looking for that universalism everywhere I go. Music is the only thing for me that does it. So, again, to perhaps use a cliche, I don't think I had a choice. It just calls me, it calls the person. So it's like prayer, it just brings everything together. And of course, I'm speaking of music in the best sense, music is part of that. It's truthful, good, if it's really music, it's truthful.
Right.
And it's beautiful, and it's good, and it lifts up everybody, and brings everything together.
Right.
Doesn't name call or anything like that.
Sure. Excellent. Yes, Matthew.
Two of our friends online. One says freedom.
Ooh.
And another says to gain grounding in a discipline or field.
To gain.
Grounding in a discipline or field.
Okay. Yes.
Since you're looking for just one word, I would say curiosity. And this is before, at least in my case, before I actually went to school. Just as a young child, people accused me of having a condition, being too curious about everything. And then
I think that's called the human condition.
Yeah, but people thought there was something maybe problematic about it.
Right.
But later I understood that my curiosity has to do with the unfamiliar. That is, to be interested in something that is really not what you would consider as part of your environment or culture and so on. I grew up in Morocco my formative years, and then I developed a very early interest, just like Nancy and so on, in English literature. Everyone was interested in French literature or Spanish literature. So I got interested in English literature, which was unfamiliar to me, being in a kind of different environment. And so this idea of curiosity, I later understood what it meant, like saying, an English saying, curiosity killed the cat.
Right.
The idea that, by being curious, it expands your horizons and you get to discover new things, not just in literature, but in so many other things. And it has a huge impact just on you as a person. And I think the idea of being curious about others whom you're not familiar with is an interesting thing. That's what leads you to an education. You want to grasp what makes people tick and how they think. It's not easy, obviously, but the very attempt is interesting to someone who's just different from you, completely different, and try to appreciate how they are thinking, how they are feeling about things.
Does that sort of fit as well?
Yes,
Desire
makes
to
sense.
understand the other?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing resonates for me in my experience at two different levels. My father was very early on an entrepreneur, and he figured out how to manage finances. And the mill was killing my grandmother. She was very unwell as a result of the work conditions that she had in the sewing room. And so my father's way of ameliorating that was to convince my grandparents to build and open a motel on the edge of town, on the main road. And they built a 10-room motel that ended up becoming very successful. And in gratitude to my father, they, in the late 50s, the trip happened in 1960. They sent my father on a 3-month tour of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And I remember as a kindergartner, we had a map of the world, and my mother was putting dots on the map where my father was, and he came back with hundreds and hundreds of slides, and so for me, that little town on the edge of the Blue Ridge almost seemed unreal compared to what was out there. I knew that there was this big world that I wanted to know and to understand. And it motivated my interest in literature and art and all kinds of other things that none of my peers were interested in at all. I discovered mythology in the 4th grade, and I became obsessed with knowing all I could about that sort of thing. The other thing, and that it was a forbidden thing in my childhood and in my teenage years. The tradition that I was raised in had an absolute prohibition on going to films, and so movies were the forbidden fruit of my childhood. And I started sneaking off to them as soon as I learned how to drive. And it's since become a major part of my teaching. I use films as text, and I'm realizing now, with this current generation, art films, serious European films, you have to teach them how to watch and interpret and understand. So my favorite course right now that I'm teaching at Duquesne is called Rule Breakers. It's a film class on the 10 Commandments, and it's built around the 10 film cycle of Krzysztof Kieślowski, called the Decalogue. But yeah, but there you have, it's that desire to understand the other and the curiosity about the unfamiliar is something that resonates a great deal to me. I appreciate you sharing that. Yes?
Well, mine isn't nearly as profound, but I can definitely identify with the freedom, because formal education wasn't valued in my family, although reading and self-education was. Both my parents were pretty self-educated, and we moved all the time, and they had small business. So I loved being in school. To me, it was freedom from work, because when you have parents who are small business owners and you're the only child, you go into the labor force extremely early.
Right.
And then full-time before I finished high school. So I think it was a freedom from basically having to work 2 jobs with my nose to the grindstone all the time to get back to what I felt I had lost in high school. I too started off in English, but then I moved into anthropology. And it was curiosity as well, but I think a lot of it was just escape from this constant work ethic that I was brought up with, where work was more important than anything else. And I think I had always had this sense that there were more important things than work, but I wasn't sure what they were. Right.
I have a memory of my first job after college. I finished in 3.5 years. Way too many units. I graduated with 170 credits, which is ridiculous. And my father just said, "Stop." But I took over from a mid-year at my old school with from a person who had no educational training and no interest in teaching, and the American history and New Testament classes that I took over had been study halls, basically, the semester before. And I found myself just coming home and weeping for 30 minutes or an hour before I turned to lesson plans. It was just miserable. And so Saturday mornings was my time to just zone out. And I would lie in bed and read a novel until noon, and I remember coming down and after a few weeks of this, and my mother said, and she was a librarian as well, but she said, I know reading is important, but the gist of it was, a responsible person should always be too busy to read. And wanted to know if I needed some help finding some volunteer work to do on the weekends. But I also can appreciate the point that you're making. It provides a kind of freedom, escape into another place, another experience when life is very challenging.
Yeah, I mean, reading is still like that for me. Reading is my big, when there's time to do it.
Sure. Yes.
I want to say inspiration. I was always inspired by colors, shapes, the world. I've always been into art, and I started as an art major. Although I ended up with an accounting degree, don't ask me why. But it was just the world itself. I was just inspired by people and the way the world looked.
Wow, that's wonderful. I've always been jealous of people who have artistic gifts that I don't have. Music was also one of those things that was always a challenge for me. I tried, but I could only get to a certain point and had to admit defeat. But the inspiration of it was always very, very, very important to me. Yes.
I grew up in a kind of different atmosphere. My family came to South America from Croatia in the early 1900s. When the people who used to come from Europe, most of them did not know how to read or write. my family was able to read and write. And that's in ways how, all the children, they helped the people who could not read or write letters, read letters to
Sure.
them. And because they had an education, my grandparents they believed that education is the most important thing.
Right.
So of the two brothers, with the children, there were 15 of them. All 15 of them went to university, became doctors, whatever, all kinds of careers. But my father was very, very, he was one of the youngest ones. He always felt a career has to be programmatic. A programmatic career, education is for a career.
Right.
But the career is not your life. You have to have a desire to know, and then for personal development. So you had to, besides going to school and learning, whatever career you were going to take, our house was filled with books, with music, going to museums, early travels around the world so that you will learn, because you have to continue to discover.
Right.
Do not just be content with the career that you chose at 18, because you may not like it when you're 25 or 35 or 45. So be open to other things. And for me, it has been like, this is my third, version, I guess.
Right.
I started in psychology and I started with a lot of working with children with disabilities. Then I went on to study finance and administration at NYU. I was on Wall Street for 20, and then this is my third, invention. But this is, in a way, working here kind of like encompasses all of the other ones.
Right.
But however, his biggest thing was that you must always have to continue to learn, always never pass it the chance to go somewhere, to read a book. And I mean, I must have been 8 or 9 he gave me a book by Animal Farm in English. It's like, okay, but I think it took me 2 or 3 times to read it before I understood that he would talk to me. And my mother was the same, so I think that for us it was like that desire to always know there's always something else that you can learn. Don't just be content with one career.
So openness to different ways of knowing?
Openness, discovery, the sense of wonder with everything, because everything is something new. Everything that you learn, everything that you do, it could open the door to something else that would fulfill you. Because in his mind, as a businessman, a business not necessarily fills you
Right.
spiritually. That's what for me yesterday I said is the growth. It's a personal growth, career, but it's also the personal growth spiritually that you can find in art, in music, in literature, in all of that. So the idea was like, as a whole person, you have to be able to know all of this. You cannot just know your field.
Right.
So I don't know, diversity maybe I don't know, but it's like always learn, always, in any possible way.
Wonderful. Father Jack, and then we'll come to you.
I think my first thing that made an impact on me when I was 3 years old was the bombing of Pearl Harbor. When I was 3 years old, I remember people said the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And that had a big impact. I still think about that. I think as I began to develop, I became interested in things like United Nations. I went to a seminary course, got ordained, and started teaching here. While I was teaching here in the 1960s and 70s, I was also getting involved in organizations like Pax Romana, which had status, ECOSOC status at the United Nations. And I got involved in things like world federalism and world citizenship. It was interesting, where I was crazy, but I got involved in things like that, kind of a broader world.
So world events.
World events.
Excellent.
Because of that, that first experience of hearing about the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And that I think, that still resonates with me today.
Excellent.
But all of the things that have happened after that, because of that, and development of the UN, my area of teaching is ecumenical study, getting involved in the global ecumenical movement.
Sure.
And all those global sorts of movements have always been fascinating for me. And,
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Father. Appreciate that. Yes.
Okay, yeah, I think what I was gonna say probably follows what you said. It was kind of a segue off of that. I've been thinking a lot during this session about the word discovery, and when we were trying to sort of bring God into that, it made me think of the word revelation, which is really been my joy in studying literature. Is, you have this human person who's giving form to human life, right? You have the artist giving form to human life. Whether it be an author or a visual artist or really a writer or a thinker in any discipline, is trying to give form to human life so that we, the readers, can see something in it. So we can kind of have this revelation of God's world, through this text. And so that's been the joy, the wonder, the inspiration, all of those things for me.
Excellent. All right. Well, this has been phenomenal. I really enjoyed listening to all of your thoughts about this. So, did our experience of education, in a formal sense, expand, or? Well, I don't know what I want to say here. Constrict, confine. Did we pursue our education because of the formal structures, or despite them, or enhanced by them? I'm curious to hear what reactions are. Yes.
Well, I don't know if that's exactly answering your question, but one of the things that struck me about Newman, the piece that we read, was that he says, education, the liberal arts does not necessarily make a Christian, it makes a gentleman, it doesn't necessarily make you a good person.
Right.
And I guess what I've been hearing about what everybody's saying, and what I always thought myself is that, when it connects you with something beyond yourself, it is, in a way, it's making you a good person. But I have to say that, when I was very, very young, faculty member, maybe even a TA, and I went to a department meeting, maybe one of the first ones I ever went to, and people were, no offense to my department, I love the English department, but they were fighting about something really stupid. I just, but they had to.
That's remarkable. I never had that experience.
And I remember seriously thinking, and of course I couldn't say this, I was like 20-something, or brand new, whatever. I'm thinking, how can you be teaching this incredible stuff and fighting about something so stupid? And I don't even remember what it was, but I've been in that situation many, many times since.
Right.
And I still don't really get it. But Newman even talks about that. He says, you can get all this wisdom, knowledge, all this, but it doesn't necessarily take away pride or, the evil in human heart.
Oh, yes.
So I just wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, at this point, since you've introduced the topic at hand, the piece that we want to discuss, I'm going to suggest that we take a 15-minute break.
Sure, you can do that now.
And then we'll pick up on. We'll get to it over the course of the next session. But your point is one that I really wanted to hone in on and discuss. So let's do that. And it's one of those. As you can probably already tell, I tend to prefer to start with reactions rather than imposing my own structure. I'm always curious to know others got out of the text. So if we could start there, for those of you who had an opportunity to look at the chapter that I asked you to read, the discourse. I'm curious to know what stood out for you in discourse 5. Knowledge its own end. So the floor is open. Yes. And I'm sorry, I'm bad at names. Lisa? Lisa.
I'm sorry, I should have marked the page, I usually scribble all over things. But he was very clearly talking about a teaching university, and there was one point earlier when he said it's from the transmission and expansion of knowledge and not basically discovery.
Right.
I'm paraphrasing that badly.
No, that's.
And that really struck me as very different from here, where we put so much emphasis on research. And that's one of the things that I find difficult with reconciling his vision of the university with here, where even though I think most of us see ourselves as primarily teaching, the emphasis, particularly the faculty, and I'm thinking rank and tenure and all the things you're rewarded for, is all about research.
Right.
And
Right.
there's this.
You've got to be adequate in the classroom, or.
But you've got to excel at research,
Right.
and yet we are given very little time or support to research. And that seems to me, I don't know if other people feel the same way, but it almost devalues teaching. Whereas
Sure.
most of us probably think it's the most important thing we do, and certainly Newman does.
Right. And I'll just revert to my historian persona for a moment. You know, one of the things that's very clear is that Newman's drawing on his experience of the Oxford system, which was not the model of Berlin, of the research university. So it wasn't that he devalued it. But he was, and to the extent that he tried to recruit a German historical theologian to come and teach doctrine. He tried to convince Ignaz von Dollinger from Munich to come and teach in Dublin. He was considered at the time to be the premier Catholic historical theologian on the continent. So it wasn't that he dismissed research, but you're right in pointing out that for Newman the value of the university that he was attempting to establish was that it would teach and form Catholics for their Irish experience in the middle of the 19th century. Yes?
Just for some historical context, when did this research university kind of come to fruition, like historically?
The concept of the research university into the 18th, beginning of the 19th century.
Okay.
You find German universities really becoming prominent for their scientific research. The Wissenschaftliche Universität was a place where research was at a premium, and really in many ways teaching was the secondary role of the professor, and so. But as we were talking about yesterday, Newman's experience of Oxford and of the college system was one that was very much about nurturing the young, shaping them intellectually, but also having a responsibility to form them in terms of men of character. Women weren't admitted to the university at the time. Yes, so he's thinking in very formative terms when he's developing his concept of the university. And I will admit, I have a research profile. I take research seriously. I have my research agenda. But as one who's shaped a Catholic Studies initiative at Duquesne University, we're very emphatically attempting to create a space, a department at Duquesne that's modeled on this vision of a department that's intentionally engaged in students outside of the classroom as well as inside. Some of that has to do with the luxury of being a department of full professors. We don't have faculty who have anxieties about the next stage of promotion. We're all serious researchers. We all do our own scholarship, but we followed the admonition of campus ministries when we consulted them and said, how does a department get involved with students in a meaningful way? And they said, be here after 4:30. And we've tried to make that more family friendly by ensuring that our faculty families feel welcome to join in on these activities. So we have teenagers and smaller children mixed in, and we actually find that students appreciate that awareness of faculty as being family people, having personal lives, being in an informal context where they can ask them questions that are beyond the formal curricular or intellectual questions that they ordinarily have. And that's very much a Newmanian vision of what collegiate life is intended to be. Does that help?
Yeah.
Fine. Great.
I just want to pick up on Nancy's comment, sort of where we ended. I found the distinction between knowledge and virtue helpful, even if I think the separation was overstated by Newman. I think of someone like Pierre Hadot, who's done great work showing that, at least in its original historical conception, philosophy was a spiritual exercise, not just a body of ideas. So to say that philosophy and virtue can't be coincident. At the same time, I think sometimes to teach without a thought about virtue, or conversely to think, we made good students whether or not they actually learned their discipline. I think both extremes can be present in the modern university, and maybe especially liberal arts classrooms, and trying to think carefully about the distinction is very helpful for thinking about the different things that we do in the same classroom, maybe.
I'm just going to bounce back and forth between the text and experience, because I think that's what we're all kind of riffing off of. One of the things that really stood out for me in a discussion with our current batch of minors and majors in Catholic Studies at Duquesne, they described their experience of our classes as being the most intellectually demanding that they've experienced. I don't see it that way. That's not my experience as a professor. I'm just doing what I do. But what I've discovered is the students, because they're so invested in the work, they put a whole lot more work into it than they imagine that they would intend to do. But they also see it as in part their commitment to it is because it seems to reach beyond the intellectual into the personal and the formative dimensions that they're longing for and that they're not finding in their ordinary curriculum. Yeah. But that distinction between knowledge and virtue was one of the things that stood out for me, and sort of resonates with what you were talking about in the faculty meeting context. I've actually experienced even worse than that. I've had colleagues because they couldn't touch me, seek to harm my graduate students in political battles within the department. And there's the distinction between knowledge and virtue. A brilliant scholar, but one who is willing to destroy careers of the young to get at a colleague. That just boggles my mind. I can't even begin to imagine how one could do that. But Newman's distinction between knowledge and virtue, I get it. Other things that stood out for you in the text? Yes.
I don't know about things, I'm gonna choose this one, so I think when.
Well, you can keep coming back.
I know.
You don't get one turn at the trough.
But you try to talk. I was really struck by this idea of breadth being really important, like having a lot of information and sort of thinking about it from two angles, like one, as we approach our middle states accreditation, what are we doing about this? Oh, don't ask. I did not get an A in spelling. VRED2H.
Did I get that
We're
right?
on those levels of literature now.
My excuse is I'm dyslexic when it comes to the board. So
I think, so about that, but then also, I would hope that Newman would be really receptive to the conversations happening. I think I've seen it in several disciplines, I don't know, everywhere, but just realizing the own limitations of our own fields, right? So the field of I'm a cognitive psychologist. The broad field of psychology issued an apology for our systemic racism. Cognitive psychology is grappling with this idea that cognitive universal has been code for whiteness, right? That scientific knowledge is the only way, if you're not thinking like a scientist, you're not thinking, right? So that this approach that we need to really take our blinders off was what I found myself thinking about this. And thinking about how we've tried to do it with Journey of Transformation and Christianity, Culture, and Dialogue, our two initial core courses, which were supposed to be taught by faculty all over the university, and that has not happened equitably or reasonably. I haven't gotten to teach it for forever because I need to teach psych classes because we're busting at the seams, right? So, not that I don't love that Greg is here teaching a lot of Journey in core two, but I don't know, it's probably not what he would have wanted. And it made me sympathetic to him wanting to just tutor students across disciplines. But that's the other thing I would love. I would love if my students brought in more connections from their other courses to my class. Like I can barely get them to see how research methods connect with another psych class. Like, no, I want to hear about your poli-sci, your theology class, your religion class. So, that's kind of my ideal, but I also understand the transfer is difficult.
And therein lies one of the great challenges of our contemporary circumstance. To what extent are we so bounded by the silos, even within our disciplines?
I don't feel qualified to talk about psycholinguistics, which is just a separate even working memory. I do memory illusions. Please only ask questions about recognition memory illusions. I will feel confident to answer. It's ridiculous.
Exactly. And so to some extent, I guess the bigger question is to what extent are we imposing what ultimately is a higher level of reasoning in our discipline to an undergraduate population that's looking for connection and integration. That's a big question mark for me. I'm very conscious. I mentioned my course on the Old Testament, the Rule Breakers class, 10 Commandments, teaching using commentaries on the 10 Commandments from 3 different traditions. Teaching using a film cycle from the late 1980s in Poland. So I have to explain what the end of communism was, why John Paul II is important in Polish history, but also European and global history, his role in the collapse of communism. how do we draw connections between that late 20th century experience in Europe, Central Europe, with contemporary American experiences of these commandments. I find it exciting, so I get to do a little bit of biblical criticism, and I suppose it's safe to admit here, I never took Old Testament in seminary or in graduate school at all. So I'm an amateur at that. I'm an amateur Polish historian. I know enough to get me in trouble. I'm not a film critic. I've never studied film criticism, but I can do enough of it so that students kind of get inspired to, do a little bit of work in serious films as opposed to what Hollywood produces more often than not. That's the kind of thing that excites me about teaching at an undergraduate level. I can dabble in things that if I were going to go to a conference on film criticism, I wouldn't dare open my mouth. But students get an opportunity to experience something that they're likely to take with them beyond that classroom experience. But breadth is important as something that's important in a teaching university or a teaching context. But I know that's a difficult one, and we sometimes feel constrained by the politics of our own departments.
Well, and the incentivization structures, which are not meant for us to work across
Exactly.
departments, right? Like, well, once you get the credit hours,
Right.
you can think about an interdisciplinary program, but maybe not before that.
Right. I got that. Yes.
All of this talk is bringing me to this passage in Knowledge on Its Own End, where he talks about knowledge is its own end, right? That he says if your reading is confined simply to one subject, it's going to contract the mind. And so on the one hand, we're talking about, our specializations kind of prevent us from being able to maybe sometimes make all of these external connections, which we would like our students to do. But I think of the English classes, and I teach in composition.
Right.
And there's also a movement through the country to eliminate literature from composition courses.
Yes.
It's a pet peeve of mine.
No, yes.
Precisely for this reason, that it is one way to just remove the reading of literature and all of the experience and the breadth that comes from that, and simply teach students. And part of the argument is that we should be teaching students to write only in their discipline. Basically, that should be our focus. I'm not qualified to teach anyone to write in any other discipline, but the kind of writing I like to work on with regard to the reading of literature is more, it has more breadth because it's really asking for a kind of universal critical thinking skill,
Sure.
That can be applied and transferred. But so that's it, right, Nancy? This is a kind of battle, and we're holding the line here at Seton Hall. But it's kind of pervading colleges across the country.
Well, I mentioned the existential crisis is wrong, maybe a strong word, but angst about professional schools offering our core courses in traditionally liberal arts fields. I'm in conversation with, likely going to be speaking with the president of this university soon, a university that's fired its theology department, fired its philosophy department, its history department. I was fascinated by the distinction. They fired everyone involved in teaching literature. And the religious order that had historically been affiliated with it, with withdrew and is no longer, as of this month, last month, engaged with that university because of its abandonment of a liberal, any semblance of a liberal education. And it's alumni that are lobbying and seeking engagement with my department to talk, okay, maybe the liberal arts are being abandoned, but surely there are enough folks there to mount a Catholic Studies program in the context to hopefully create at least the semblance of an interdisciplinary connection with the liberal arts. But I agree with you, that narrowness limits growth and limits vision. The thing that stood out for me in my work creating an Associate of Arts degree program at a maximum security prison was the persistent attention given to the practical and courses that would be of utility to the students. The persistent comment was, they don't need an education, they need a skill set. And I continued to insist, and I succeeded in transforming our core from St. Louis University into an Associate of Arts degree program. So they got history, they got literature, they got writing classes, they got philosophy, anthropology, those sociology. They got those range of courses, and what I learned from my students, especially those who were paroled, was that they were conscious of the fact that they could think in larger terms, that they were thinking about the experience of other people. They weren't reacting to situations. They were stepping back and thinking, I used to simply react with violence. Now I can sort of see, okay, I don't have to escalate this. You listen to these guys thinking, oh, we weren't teaching anger management. We weren't teaching, all of those things that were supposed to be the way to rehabilitate. We were encouraging thinking, rational engagement with the world. And these were people who were transformed. Some of them became people of deep and profound faith. Some of them remained unattached. As Newman would say, a good education doesn't make you a Christian. It might go a ways towards making you a gentleman or a gentlewoman. That was a deep learning experience for me. But the idea of narrowness of formation is something that I think is a real risk today. Yeah. Other reactions to the text?
Yes. I get a second dip.
You do,
because
absolutely.
This was very early on, and he talked.
I've got my list of things that I can bring up if we run out, but I'm much more interested in your reactions.
Well, where he talked about education kind of after basic needs had been met, and there's several places where he said that. And I know a lot of our students, that's not the case.
Right.
I mean, I'm very privileged in a way because I'm in the library. I get to work with students from, I'm liaison to all of the sciences and anthropology, sociology, social work, criminal justice, the core. So I work with a huge range of students, and that's one of the things that really strikes me, is how many of those basic needs haven't been met. They're working, they have childcare responsibilities, they have family responsibilities. So, it makes me realize how privileged I was particularly when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student. I mean, as a grad student, I had to teach a little bit. I waitressed a couple of nights a week, but a lot of these young people, they're working full-time.
Yeah.
But some of them are working several jobs to make ends meet, so how can they possibly be devoting all their attention to learning when there's these unmet needs?
Right, right.
And that's a challenge, I think.
Well, you wouldn't know it from the text of the idea of a university. But one of the things that, Newman was not simply an idealist, he was practical. One of the things that initially drew me to the young man who's our program manager for Catholic Studies at Duquesne is he did a master's thesis on Newman's idea of a university and with speculations about what he might think of online education. And one of the things that Garrett discovered in Newman's occasional papers and in our digital manuscript collection at the National Institute for Newman Studies was that Newman recognized, okay, my ideal scenario is simply not practical for a lot of people. And so he created night classes. He was something of an innovator in thinking, okay, there are people who have professions, they have to make a living. They don't have the ability to take off even a day for an education. So let's have night classes. Let's have night lectures, and it drew in laborers and people in trades, and the merchants of the city. I'm glad you caught that caveat, because that was very much on my mind. I will admit that as an educator, I constantly feel not the weight, but the obligation of my privilege. I know I had a very privileged experience of education in many different ways. And therefore, being conscious of what is a practical obstacle to my students is something that I need to be mindful of. And not simply assume that my experience of education is normative.
I started taking night classes, that's how I got into college initially.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't teach, so I'm not, the students aren't at all, but my experience just from someone looking from outside and having raised a young man, and I think that also when they come to the university, and a lot of the students have come from public schools, and in many cases they are the first generation coming to the university. So they have not had that nurturing for learning at home. And then in high school, I don't know about public school, but in general, they spent the last year and a half, testing, training for the SATs and all of that. So they're so connected to the rankings, the point system that the schools leave all of this other, knowledge for the spirit and the mind on the side, because the schools are ranked based on how they do, and they put the pressure on the students. So when they come here, and I guess they go to the first, journey of transformation classes, what is this about? They have never picked up the, philosophy text, they have never read it, they have never, maybe not because they're not interested, but because they never had the opportunity. So I imagine that I remember when my son was here as a freshman, he had been told he studied oratory prep, so they had those classes, but there were students in his journey of transformation. They had no idea, they didn't know what. So within the students that had been at a private school where they had that experience, they were kind of tutoring the other ones, give them the guidelines. So it has to be really hard for them, for many of them coming, considering not everyone comes from a situation where you have had that experience, being exposed to that. So that's why they're so narrow, the high school sometimes. It's all about how you're going to do, where you're going to go.
So narrow reading or secondary education
Right.
is another dimension of this. Yes, Greg?
I was just building on Mary Ann's point earlier. I was struck by Newman's sense that a university, even if a student is not going to take every class in every liberal art, the student at like the level of character or mentality maybe benefits from an atmosphere in which he or she is surrounded by people who are doing these things in specific and deliberate and disciplined ways. And it struck me because I think it teaches you a kind of reverence for the other disciplines, right? When you see people you know and love excelling in them, even if you've chosen a different path and you've taken a year of science and a year of math and know just enough to know what you don't know in some ways, you know? And then the challenge in the modern university where more and more core requirements are determined by individual schools and not by a university with a sort of shared consensus around no matter what your specialization is, we want you to have two classes of A, B, C, D, and E, you know?
Right.
But kind of outsourcing to independent contractors.
Right. Well, I remember a colleague of mine at St. Louis University, Richard Valentassis, referred to this kind of experience as passive learning. You learn by exposure, not by deep learning, but by engagement with people who are deeply steeped in a particular field, not your own. I made reference yesterday to the experience of living at Lake Hampton, at the graduate hostel at Cambridge of my college, Corpus Christi College. And one of my best friends was a chemist. He became a leader in research in BP, ended his career a few years ago as a head of alternative energy sources for BP, thank God. He didn't increase my understanding of chemistry. We didn't have casual conversations about those sorts of things. But what he did do was help me understand a bit better basic principles. I found myself as a theologian with training in history, speaking rather apologetically about the subjective character of my discipline, and conceded the objective character of his field. And I remember him stopping me and he's laughing and saying, "Ken, who designs the experiments? People. Who carries out the experiments? People. Who collects the data? People. Who interprets the data? People." And I began to realize, oh, okay, I get the message. There's a subjective character to empirical research as well, and that was for me an important principle that I've never forgotten. Clearly, decades later, but I can think of other ways in which colleagues from other disciplines helped shape my appreciation for other fields of knowledge, even though I never picked up a book on the subject during that period. But that passive learning, and engagement with people with fields other than one's own, I think is a really important part of being a broadly educated person. And I think that's part of what Newman is trying to get at with his idea of knowledge for its own sake, having its own end, because it enables you to appreciate and maintain and augment an interest in the experience of others. Yes, Matthew.
From our friends online here. Someone shared earlier before the break that their experience at the undergraduate level was being exposed to various disciplinary perspectives and controversies, while always wondering how everything fit together, a project that I've been obsessed with ever since. The professors that really stood out were those that attempted to be integrative in some way, and their contribution to my intellectual development has been palpable. Followed up with what resonated with me from Newman is the emphasis he placed on integrative inquiry, that is, on how each discipline can help complete the others.
Right. That's excellent. I think that's a very important observation for all of us to have in mind as we think about our work with students. That it doesn't necessarily stop with the textbook or the syllabus. I think students long for that sense of connectedness and what it means to be what it means to have that learned person modeled for them. I sometimes I think about my periods in my own career as a professor in which I found myself lagging in terms of my passion for the work, going through the motions. I will admit that one of the reasons why I got involved in prison education, apart from the fact that I hadn't really intended to do it, I sort of I demur and usually say, well, God made me do it. I hit upon an idea and just started asking questions, and followed it up with meetings and phone calls, and quite remarkably, it felt like despite myself, I found myself in a prison classroom 8 months later, and discovered a new passion for my intellectual work. I got to teach theology, I got to teach history in the prison setting. I taught people who were inside for a wide array of reasons, from murder to child abuse and everything in between, as well as prison guards who really struggled, corrections officers who really struggled with growing up and being trapped by their rural circumstances. And so for, I guess I'm bringing all of those things up to say, being willing to engage students whose lives are about struggle and challenge, and not be afraid of that. I think some of us can be afraid of acknowledging the difficulties and the weaknesses and the profoundly damaging life experiences of our students, and worry that that's taking us away from the real work, which is about communicating information and mastery of skills. And all of those things are important. But if we look back on our own experience of education, those aren't the professors that we remember. We remember the professors who modeled something profound that we wanted to emulate. Yes?
I'll just be quick. It's very moving to think of what you're doing with those people in prison. And it makes me think of Newman's efforts to tutor to be a tutor. We have a writing center here where we tutor students, and it's kind of an act of accompaniment, and it seems that may be a large part of what you were doing with these people in prison, is accompanying them on a journey, and on a journey of transformation. I hate to say that.
That's fine. Transformation works for me.
But this resonates so deeply with me because in my journey of transformation class, my students do service learning, and they encounter, I have a ministry where I work with people who are struggling with addiction, and they have dialogues with them. So it's what I try to help them see is that these moments, 2 hours here and there through the semester, these moments in which they walk with these people is hopefully I know it's fruitful for the people in recovery. They love it. But also for them, and then they write about it. But I also, it just brings to mind some of the people in recovery that I work with. So I guess you could say that it's almost like tutoring that person in life, because
Sure.
I see, these people that have had very, very difficult, many of them, not all, but very difficult lives, and their life has kind of shrunken in on them with their addiction. And when you start to simply be their friend, their mentor, their tutor, to talk about things other than their addiction,
Right.
talk about life as if they really are human beings that
Right.
have a place in the world, it's just amazing to see how they start to move away from that activity. They move away from
Sure.
the desire to do this because there's something else that is now enriching their lives, and they're feeling like human beings, little by little. It's a really beautiful experience, and it just kind of reminds me of what, how I think how important it was to Newman to reach the whole person, to address the humanity of your students, or in this case, I kind of consider some of these people that I talk to every day, that I encourage, that we have conversations about various things, and especially about the faith,
Sure.
They're very hungry to understand that God loves them and that they have a place, and there's so much for them to know, and they're hungry for it in ways that are just really remarkable to me. It's very moving, and I just think of that same thing must be happening in your prison classes.
Well, and it's interesting that you frame it that way because I don't know if anyone else here has had the experience of teaching in a prison context. So the kind of contact that you can have with students in that context is very constricted, and office hours unthinkable. You can't engage with them outside of the context of that classroom. But one of the most profound things about the classroom is treating them like students. You're walking into the classroom, I learned by happenstance that the guy sitting right next to me, to my left, was a guy that whose case ended the juvenile death penalty in America. Chris Simmons. He committed a despicable murder when he was 17. One of the most profoundly spiritual people I've ever met. A man who's a friend. But what made the difference was, as far as I was concerned, I didn't know that until I later learned that one of my best friends, who was a judge, had been his public defender. I was describing this kid, and Mike said, got wide-eyed and he said, "You're not talking about Chris Simmons, are you?" And I learned Chris's story that way. But it was by recognizing the humanity and exercising the practice of respecting the dignity of the person in front of me that made the difference in the classroom. Same with the corrections officers. We don't recognize that they're an at-risk population, as we say, and the line is very porous between being free and being incarcerated in that population. So education is equally important there. But why? How do we stray from Newman's ideal of knowledge for its own sake to this topic? Because these are people who are hungry for knowledge, hungry for mentoring, deeply desirous of people who imagine them capable of developing character and shaping a life other than what their worst act in life had been. So that dignity of the human person that we talk about so much in the 20th and 21st century, I think is what Newman is getting at in the 19th. Yes?
So we have three comments that all, and I'll read them, two pointing us to passages and then one from Mary Ellen who teaches graduate nursing.
Okay.
They all revolve around what is the character of the kind of knowledge Newman is talking about, sort of what is the nature of it. So
Okay.
Jamie's pointing us towards the quote, there is a knowledge worth possessing for what it is and not merely for what it does. John, also on page 54, drew our attention to, in order to have possession of truth at all, we must have the whole truth, and no one science is the whole truth. And then sort of giving a practical example, as Mary Ellen said, Newman speaks of the branches of knowledge and how they're connected to one another. In teaching graduates in a professional school, which is in the College of Nursing, it is important for students and faculty to understand how this knowledge, these different kinds of knowledge, is intimately connected. These non-nursing courses are just as important for their intellectual pursuits as the nursing classes are for caring for people.
Yeah.
So sort of the knowledge that is for its own sake, how does Newman describe it, and sort of how do we defend it?
How do we defend it? Some of it is I would agree with you, about the challenge of that, and I never had to explain that in the prison context. I found that it was something that has to be nurtured and encouraged, that insight on the main campus. And I think some of that may have to do with ironically, the challenge of the privilege of choosing, or that late adolescent, early adult emphasis on being interested in what they're interested in, and not particularly eager to be be challenged to think in other ways. I can remember after my first experience of teaching in a prison setting, teaching a Maymester course to a group of very indifferent seniors who had walked but had that one last class to take before they graduated. And it was the theology class that they had avoided and avoided. And so it was the last thing that they had to do, and I found myself sort of about a week into the 3-week course wanting to just scream at them, "Don't you realize what a privilege this is?" I don't know how we convince except by example and enthusiasm for what we do, and maybe making the personal connection of how it's impacted our own experience of life. And I wonder whether some of it isn't a matter of maturity and understanding. You know, when I think about my youngest, who was singularly focused on becoming an entrepreneur, and sort of had his first go at creating a business when he was 15, with a guy that he's now created a real business with at 21. But you know, as far as he was concerned, college was a waste of time, and he sort of subverted the whole college application process his senior year of high school. I wasn't certain whether I'd get him through high school or not at one point. And now, you know, he didn't take his gen ed courses as seriously as I would have liked for him to, but he acknowledges at the very end of that was a missed opportunity. And I don't know whether some of it is the whetting of curiosity that will mature and blossom later in life.
Sometimes I tell my students I'm teaching their junior selves.
Yes.
Just have to remember it for 4 semesters.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking about like this last phrase, we attain to heaven by using this world well, though it is to pass away. We perfect our nature, but not by undoing it, but by adding to it what is more than nature, and directing it towards aims higher than its own. And I love that quote because it kind of gets to...
Read it one more time slowly so everyone can hear it.
It's the very last quote in the piece. We attain to heaven by using this world well, though it is to pass away. We perfect our nature not by undoing it, but by adding to it what is more than nature, and directing it towards aims higher than its own.
Comment on that.
I just love that phrase because I think it gets to like the answer to some extent to like, you know, the education doesn't make the Christian, and that's true. But I mean, I remember Greg said, well, I think he pushed it too far, but I think this is where he corrects that kind of, or I don't know if you want to say that. Like, because I felt too that like almost like it's not that separate, and I think the way that it can become connected to, you know, salvation, I guess you could say, and Christian love, is by bringing, you know, Christ, you know, or like even if you're not a Christian, bringing God into it and His love, because like it can go the other way too. You know, like I was thinking, like Melinda was talking about there's like a trend to separate literature or whatever. There can be pernicious trends in education, and you know, there's a book called I think it's called Deconstruction in the Fall of Paul the Mom. By David Lehman, and it's like about the really what he perceives as the destructive aspects of deconstruction in the field of in our field in English literature, and how there was this person at Yale, which we were just talking about Yale, Paul Dumont, who was a very, I don't mean to get to as a terrible.
No, please.
But like Paul Dumont was like this very, very well respected French scholar who was teaching at Yale, and my husband actually had a course with him. But he walked out on it. He felt it was like not truthful. And then it came out that Paul Dumont had actually, when he was in France during World War II, he had written things that were pro-Nazi. And the deconstructionists, some of them at Yale, came to his defense and said, oh, he didn't mean that. They actually, in a sense, almost deconstructed, but clearly he was writing pro-Nazi things. So, you know, that, I guess what I'm trying to say is that you can that knowledge, yes, it doesn't make the Christian, but you can do it in a virtuous way, or you can do it in a way that's not virtuous.
Right. That's fascinating to me because I remember hearing exactly that kind of concern, framed in slightly different ways in a philosophical sense, from my middle son. As I was driving him to the airport from his younger brother's graduation. But, you know, that the anxiety around the negative impact that he sees postmodern critical theory having in framing purpose and meaning in life for his generation. Which does kind of get me to, maybe if I could just shift the emphasis here for a moment. We've been talking about knowledge, but I think in Newman's context, talking about knowledge was self-evidently about the quest for truth, both with a capital T and a lowercase t. And one of the things, again, two graduating seniors, so this is very immediate for me as a parent. Both boys express concern about what they either have picked up from the popular culture or informal settings of instruction, what they both have referred to as an era of post-truth. So, how do we, it's not just a matter of promoting the concept of knowledge for its own sake. How do we, what is our role in this current climate, in a culture that radically questions whether the pursuit of knowledge that leads to any kind of truthful representation of the world or of ourselves or of our role and purpose in life. How do we assist students in the context in which we're living in today? Yes?
Well, this is something
Lisa.
we come across all the time, the students coming with research projects, and of course, they're always encouraged to seek multiple perspectives, right? That's on so many assignments.
Right.
And somehow this sort of gets shifted in many of their minds to, if you ask a question, they will answer, it depends on your perspective, which is very true. But what they're kind of missing is that if you put all those perspectives together, there is actually a truth out there if you could see it, especially, if you're biased in one direction or the other. So it's, to me anyway, kind of helping the students with research, it's a matter of recognizing there are different perspectives, there are different biases. Like, my perspective as a faculty member is going to be different from your perspective as a student, but that doesn't mean one of us is right and one of us is wrong, or there's no truth out there. It's kind of a matter of getting past all those different little pieces and putting them together. And I think one of the things that, not the students, I think we all struggle with is, they get so many opinions, like news and social media and so on, that are pushing one perspective, that they struggle with finding different perspectives and putting together that there is kind of an ultimate truth, if that makes sense.
Yes.
But yeah, that's something I see a lot of, this it depends where you're coming from idea.
I just following up, I think of it in sort of my own sophomore and freshman classrooms at like two levels. There really are ideas that are pernicious. And sometimes those ideas really are the reason students, get confused. But I think there's an affective dimension to it too and it can be one of two things. It's either apathy or exhaustion from triaging a million data points a second, right? On things they didn't even know they cared about because of what they searched 3 nights ago on Google.
Right.
Something else is coming up on their phone when they go to scroll through social media. And so there's other times it is apathy in the face of seemingly irreconcilable differences and a focus on what they can control. And other times I think it's exhaustion. But in either case, there's the need to awaken a desire for truth. And not just as a possibility, but as even if it's impossible, it's something I can't avoid needing, right? Even if I'm fated to never find it, there is this need to search for it, right? And that, to me, is the first step of, I do this exercise where I walk in and ask them a set of quantifiable questions. And I just write a bunch of numbers on one side of the board, Then I draw a line down and ask them about the meaning of the Mona Lisa, and then ethical questions and religious questions, and we put a bunch of question marks on the right side of the board, right? And of course, they all say, well, those are subjective, and those ones are objective. Then you ask them what questions matter more to get right, and they all point to the right side of the board. Like, am I a bad person if I mess up my economics exam? Well, no, but am I a bad person if I think the wrong way, vote the wrong way, act the wrong way? Well, then yes, I feel like my ethical identity is bound up with these questions I can't answer in quantifiable ways. So there's this strange sort of paradox of kind of despair in the face of any sort of consensus around these answers, but yet an unavoidable sense that they matter to me a lot, you know, in terms of how I answer them, or that I'm at stake in a different way in the ethical and moral and religious questions I answer than the other ones that I spend most of my time at Seton Hall thinking about in the classroom.
Right. What you're bringing to my mind is I've talked about the challenges of our new curriculum at Duquesne. One of the things that I really do like a great deal about our Bridges program is our essential questions classes, which faculty are encouraged to create. And I've created a course entitled Whose Humanity Matters. And it's thematically focused around introducing them to systems of incarceration as means of both dehumanization of the other, but also occasions of transcending those efforts to dehumanize. I use the Holocaust as the familiar example for the students who think that their middle school unit on the Holocaust has taught them everything they need to know about it. And we look at the evolution of Auschwitz as a structure of dehumanization and genocide, and then look at Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which I learned from my students in the prison, is a prison survival manual.
Wow.
It's not a philosophical art text or an autobiography. It's a manual on how to get through that trauma, and then I move on to what I really want students to be mindful of, and that is the centuries, it's not over yet, practice of the incarceration of African Americans and the system of dehumanization that has led to the structured incarceration that we have of people of color, and the way in which the Black liberation theologian James Cone talks about the transcendence of that oppression that didn't last for 12 years like the Holocaust, but lasted for generations, in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. But I bring all that up to say I do constructive theological work in the last half of the class, because I try to make the point that we talk about the dignity of the human person in the Christian tradition because of what Christians believe about the incarnation and the created order. You know, humanity is created in the image of God. In the first chapter of Genesis, humanity is given the role of steward in the garden, and by extension, in creating order, and then looking at how human choices end up damaging that image, and creating an atmosphere in which human life is devalued by the fourth chapter of Genesis with Cain and Abel. And then what Christians talk about in the God's identification with humanity in the incarnation, the teachings of Jesus that are fundamentally subversive of so many ways in which people are marginalized, and his self-identification with people most marginalized and who are ultimately unjustly incarcerated, unjustly tried, and who suffer and die at the hands of judicial systems. It's, and it's fascinating to watch students over the course of the semester experience a kind of transformation in their thinking, because they, despite themselves, they early on in the course they start qualifying who is more human than others, and that's a fascinating process to watch them work through. But let's come back to Newman's piece on knowledge its own end. The division that he made between knowledge that is useful and knowledge that is important and valued for its own sake, that philosophical habit, or the habit of mind that's cultivated by the pursuit of knowledge. I love that. I love that term. And Greg, I think the question that you were raising is how do we cultivate that in students, regardless of what our discipline is, regardless of where we stand in the curricular structures of our institution. How do we achieve that higher purpose of an education so that our students leave the university not simply with skills of the moment, which will likely cease being of professional utility 10 years from now, but with a set of principles, and I think the term transferable skills was used earlier. A liberal education that gives students the capacity to continue to be learners, to continue to be curious, to continue to experience wonder, develop a love for human creations of a variety of sorts, and discover in it freedom from their immediate circumstances, whatever challenge that might be, or discover a new direction that's life-giving, that's transformative, whatever age one might be, not just 18 or 19, but even guys like me in their late 60s. We developing that capacity to continue to experience what can be generative in our lives.
I think just there you gave two very different, but to my mind equally important examples, right? One is, and it's very much Viktor Frankl, a sort of a capacity for resilience,
right?
For choosing one's attitude in the face of suffering, which is unavoidable in some measure for all of us. But the second one is also one that I think that always resonates with students, that first one. But the second thing you described is really capacity for delight in literature, in thinking, in discovery, in discerning choices of action. And to me, that I think is the harder work of the classroom, is to show them that this is actually just not just good when things get hard. I mean, I think that's obvious and poignant in certain ways, and maybe the place to start. but that it's about a kind of a quality of life for your whole life and the rest of your life.
Right.
But as you said earlier, I'm not sure you can convince them of that without just doing it with them. There's something about the evidence of the activity itself.
And this is where the importance of example and praxis is really important. One of the things that I love most, and I'm happy to say has been a consistent theme in my student evaluations is students talk about my passion for my subject and the fact that I really love what I do and that it shows. That kind of feedback isn't just about me, but it's about what they're looking for and what they find a certain kind of delight in. They pick up when we're bored. They pick up when we're not passionate about what we do, or cease caring about them and their formation. But what's incredibly life-giving about the work that we do, the opportunity that we have, is to watch people, young people who want to be mentored, who want to be guided in life, to see what's possible, and for care that extends beyond necessarily what whether one agrees with them or not, but accepts them and engages with them where they are. That I find is very, very important. Yes.
That's a good question about trying to put all this together, right? And being very conscientious that I was raised in a Catholic faith. It was very clear that God loved you a whole lot, and your parents loved you a whole lot. But I've seen a very depressing pie chart, but not everyone gets that version of God. So I think it's like, God's really mad at you, and it's looking to be more mad.
Right.
Not hard.
Yeah.
So.
You're speaking of my childhood paradigm.
Oh, you have that one.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh
Look
yeah.
how you turned out so well, right? So you can get out of that. No, you're still stuck up.
In my worst moments.
So, I mean, is that part of it? Thinking about what Greg was saying, like, I don't think my students feel like they have permission to experience delight. They talk very clearly about their own. I have to do a self-compassion exercise for part of my classes, and they say it's incredibly difficult and so important to do that. So, I'm very late to this, right? I was very much raised like, if you counterbalance something, you don't have to worry about anything else. Emotions, you should only care about emotions if you were studying emotional words. That's actually wrong. Emotions are walking into the classroom. So I guess my question is, with Newman's conversion, is he converting into this sort of version of orienting towards, because I was also taught God knew everything, right? So God knows everything, and God's totally loving. Then when you're learning things, you're moving towards love, which is delightful. Is that how Newman sees things? Is that how we should be seeing? Because I try to bring that into my classroom, right? That's how I would want students to feel like I care about them, but I also care so much about counterbalancing. I really like counterbalancing things. It allows me to make causal points. So like how does Newman see, because I don't know, because I didn't take a lot of history classes.
Okay.
It's not required at Youngstown State University.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. My mind is going to a piece of music, a setting of Newman's poetry, and maybe this is a good place to sort of transition toward the end of today, but thinking about tomorrow. I was still discerning about becoming a Roman Catholic when a couple of Anglican friends of mine invited me to go down from Cambridge to London to hear a performance of Elgar's setting for Newman's Dream of Gerontius. I didn't know anything about the poem, had no clue what it was about. It wasn't until I was sitting reading the libretto as the performance was going on that I realized that this was Newman's way of reimagining purgatory. It completely, I was struggling with the topic at the time. And, you know, I'd read Dante's Purgatorio as a high school senior. And sort of like Greg, I sort of look back, I must have underlined all the wrong passages. But it was about punishment, it was about retribution for misconduct in this life. And Newman turned all that around. Google Go Forth Upon Thy Journey, O Christian Soul, for this kind of triumphant prelude to Gerontius's journey to the beatific vision. And it's about love. It's about being drawn into the searing, purifying love of God. That's not about fear or retribution or punishment, but it's about a kind of intensity that draws us into that love that's beyond imagining. And I left the performance thinking, okay, I get it.
Sold.
Sold, exactly. But Newman recognized that a theological treatise on purgatory wouldn't get the message across. The priest who prepared me tried to do that, and I read it, and I was not moved at all. But it was poetry and music that did it for me. I have an intuitive understanding that I couldn't intellectually articulate. And still don't think I can adequately. But it's where I think all of this that we've been talking about this morning really fits in. And Newman does, toward the end of this discourse, sort of make the point, okay, I've tried my best, but knowledge is good in itself, just believe me. And I find myself kind of there as well. It's in the end, it's in a world that seems to be pushing us all, professors, students, general society, toward what's util, and if it's not a matter of utility, what's the point? The point is affirming our humanity and drawing us into a deeper awareness of the dignity of every human person.